Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the panel discussion, In Between Literatures, Contemporary Writing in Central Europe and North America in the Age of COVID, brought to you by the Austrian Cultural Forum in Ottawa and the Worth Institute for Austrian and Central European Studies. My name is Joseph Patridge. I'm the director of the Worth Institute, and I'd like to welcome you all to this discussion today. Before we start, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on territory delineated by Treaty 6 of 1876 in the traditional lands of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and other Indigenous peoples. The Worth Institute is an interdisciplinary cultural and research center based in the Faculty of Arts at the University of Alberta. We're supported by a private endowment as well as by the Austrian Federal Ministry of Education, Science, and Research. Our mandate is a national one. What we're supposed to do at the Worth Institute is help people in North America, and particularly Canada, learn more about Central Europe, Austria and Central Europe. In addition to the support of the Austrian government, for which we are very grateful, the Worth Institute works closely with the governments of Croatia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, as well as Slovenia. We're part of a network worldwide of Austrian centers, which are based in Israel, the United States, and Europe. And in Canada, one of our primary partners is the Austrian Cultural Forum in Ottawa. And to tell you more about the Austrian Cultural Forum and what they do, I'd like to turn over now the screen to my colleague in Ottawa, Hannes Machor. Hannes, it's all yours.
Thank you, Professor Patrouche, and hello, everybody. I'm Hannes Machor, the director of the Austrian Cultural Forum at the Austrian Embassy in Ottawa. I'm thrilled that the Austrian Cultural Forum is able to co-host today's event with the Wirth Institute. The Cultural Forum brings together creative people from Austria and Canada. This can be scientists, scholars, artists, including writers. We want them to come to Canada to present their work here, to engage with their Canadian counterparts and the Canadian public. In this endeavor, the Cultural Forum and the Wirth Institute complement each other very well. Our institutions have enjoyed a long-standing and valued partnership for many years, and we are very thankful for that. The pandemic has had a serious impact on the cultural sector, including on those working on the front line, writers, publishers, translators, many of whom are self-employed and work with small budgets. And this brings us to the topic of our discussion today. How is the pandemic affecting writing and publishing both in North America and Central Europe? At this point, I would like to acknowledge Xenia Kopf, who has brought together our panelists, a panel of experts and practitioners who will deep dive this question. I appreciate you all being here today. Xenia will introduce you individually in a moment. Before I turn over the floor to Xenia, allow me to introduce her. Xenia is a PhD candidate in literary studies at the University of Salzburg and Mozarteum Salzburg. And last but not least, Xenia was Austria's Doctoral Research Fellow at the Wirth Institute from 2019 to 2020. Xenia, thank you so much for all your hard work in coordinating today's event, and I hand the mic over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much also from my side. Huge thanks to the hosts, Dr. Machor and Professor Patridge. And thanks so much for taking the time and being here to our three panelists. I'll first give you a short outline of this panel in terms of content and structure. I'll then introduce the three panelists, and the panelists will then give us short inputs each on their respective work field. We'll then move on to discussion among the panelists, and then open the floor for Q&A by the participants. So yeah, thank you very much for being here, for tuning in. If you're a participant, please, if you have a question, use the Q&A function of Zoom. You can find it on the bottom of your Zoom window, and just type in the questions anytime they come up, and we'll address them a little later in the panel. So to give you a little bit of an idea what the background for this panel is, Dr. Machor has already addressed it. Our starting point was this observation that the global COVID crisis let our life worlds both explode and implode. So on the one hand, we're increasingly connected, like we are right in this moment, through virtual channels across continents, across time zones, across languages. But at the same time, our physical mobility has dropped to almost nothing. We're actually not having social gatherings at the moment. We're experiencing a weird situation where spaces of work and of recreation and of family life are collapsing into one single place for many of us, since we rarely actually leave our homes. So my thought about this was that literature has a long-standing history as some kind of coping strategy for times of confinement, which we find ourselves in at this moment. And this is true both for the practice of writing and the practice of reading. So literature can be experienced as traveling across time and space. And I was wondering whether the current pandemic times let us experience this dimension of literature more, or whether the heavy repercussions that also literature, the field of literature feels, because it's a globalized field, whether those are so overwhelming that maybe the positive aspects of reevaluating literature get drowned out. So I'd like to give a warm welcome to our panelists. I'll start off with Vasyl Lozynskyi. He's a Ukrainian author. He's a poet and also a translator who's currently based in Canada. He has published several poetry collections, lots of articles and essays in a number of magazines and journals, both in Central Europe as well as in the US. His books also have appeared in Germany, in Poland, and in the US. He's not only a writer, he's also a member of a curatorial association called Hudrada, which is Arts Council translated. And he's co-editor of a magazine called Prostori, which is Spaces, if you translate it to English. His poetry has been translated into 8 different languages, and I'm very curious to hear a little more about that maybe later. One of his collections was published in German under the title Das Fest nach dem Untergang in 2016 by the publishing house Machor. The second panelist I'd like to welcome here is Johanna Öttl. She's a literary scholar and a literary critic, and she's based in Vienna. She's head of programming at Alte Schmiede in Vienna, which is, I would say, one of the most important hubs for contemporary literature in Austria. So she's taking care of readings of book presentations, panel discussions around literature, everything that we might say is actually not happening at the moment, but I'm pretty sure we'll hear more on that and in what ways it is actually happening a little later in her input. And the third panelist, Clemens Berger, he's an author. He's currently based in Vienna too. He has already taught at Mozarteum University in Salzburg and also at Bowling Green State University in the US. He was a co-editor of the pan-European online magazine Versopolis. And his recent novels include Ein Versprechen von Gegenwart from 2013 and Im Jahr des Panda from 2016, And his most recent novel, Der Präsident, was published just this last fall in Residenz Verlag. So we're very curious to hear about your experiences of publishing a book amid a pandemic. And maybe now I'll turn around the order and we'll hand the floor over to Clemens Berger and ask him to give us his input. I think that he's going to read parts of his work to us and tell us a little bit more about where the idea for this book came from. Clemens, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Xenia, and thank you, everyone, and everyone I do not see, which is the strange thing happening nowadays. And I'm going to, no, I'll just start with reading a small part, a really small part out of my novel, The President. The translation was done by Jeffrey C. House, who is a professor emeritus at Bowling Green State University. He was a policeman when he became the President of the United States. He was 55 years old. His hair was black and full, his posture upright, his energy unflagging. In 6 years, he did not want to retire. He wanted to go on pension. He still had big plans. That's the first lines of my latest novel, which is at the same time the first novel I ever published in the midst of a pandemic, which is a strange thing. And as Xenia pointed out, it was published in early August, on August 1st, which was a little bit a different time with the lockdown in Austria not being in full effect, and with again, there were some readings and cultural events, but they were different. I think probably Johanna is going to talk more about it later, which meant there was only a third of the audience admitted, that's usually admitted, and people had to register, and you had to take all those precautions with wearing masks and disinfecting and things. But still, I was a little bit, let's say, lucky. It was the right time, and there were still some readings until in November everything was closed down again. And I remember, which was a really strange thing, and that's all I can talk about, because I think we're still in the midst of it, or we're still in a pandemic, and we don't really see where it's going. So I think really the last live reading was in Cologne, and I went to Cologne, and even traveling was interesting, to put it mildly. You had to get tested every time I was traveling to Germany, for example, or for all the readings. And so the last one, I didn't know it was the last one. So one was scheduled to take place in Cologne, and it was at the time of the book fair in Frankfurt, which then did not really take place. And so they wanted to do something alternative, and people had been working on it for a long time, and it was a beautiful venue. And so, but really on the day I was supposed to read, the German Chancellor stepped in front of the cameras and told her citizens to better stay at home. So there were maybe 20 people in the audience, which was kind of strange. And that was it. It was kind of the end. And then what started was something like what we're doing now, which is a little bit different, because we're talking to each other and we're going to discuss. And I remember the first time I had an online reading, and I think it was in May, out of the new novel, even before it was published. And I thought, okay, that's a funny thing, I'm going to do it. But it was really, for me, I do like readings a lot, and I do like to read, and I do like to see and feel and the audience, and what is something coming back, and is there someone smiling, or does someone look furious, or is someone snoring, whatever. So having the first reading and just in front of a screen and looking at a screen and reading into a screen, I think some people might enjoy that. I did not enjoy it as much. It was an interesting experience, but it was just like talking into a void, I would say, to some extent, even though there was a Q&A function, I think, but it was always lagging behind. So I was reading and then I tried to read comments or questions. And so I don't know where that's really going and when there will be readings again and how they will be maybe transformed. On the other hand, I do see that some interesting formats are coming up. I think it's a little bit boring just to have a reading that's being taped maybe and then it's put on YouTube, and I don't know if anyone's really watching it. So I think that was the reading part, and the other part of publishing a book in the midst of a pandemic was really how is there an audience, is there in the media, is there room for literature and things or cultural things when everyone else is really talking about one topic. So I was lucky, but then again, when I think if all those poor writers who did have books maybe in late February or in the beginning of March, which was a completely different story, because then, I mean, it was just completely gone and there were no readings and all, and there were no book fairs. So I think that's for the beginning what I can say about my president, and still I was kind of lucky. That's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Clemens. This is a great point to make. The question in how far literature as an event can actually work these times. So I would like to pass the floor to Johanna now, because this is exactly what she's dealing with in her field of work. Johanna, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Xenia. Thank you everyone else for being here. It was suggested to me that I might start off by explaining one or two things about the background of literature houses in Austria and Alte Schmiede in particular, because some of you might not be too familiar with the kind of structure or the field that I'm working in, basically. So I'd like to mention that in Austria, sorry, something weird popped up on my screen. In Austria, every one of the 9 provinces, or every capital of the 9 provinces, has a venue for literary events, which is funded by public money, by the state or by the county. And Vienna hosts 3 of these houses of literature. Alte Schmiede is one of them. And I think what is important is that this kind of public funding enables most of us that we don't have to take entrance fees. So Alte Schmiede doesn't take any entrance fees, which is also due to the political decision that we would like to be an inclusive institution that enables access independent of socioeconomic status. And in the pandemic, this is particularly important because we do not have to rely on entrance fees. And this is important for being the question of, are you able to continue your work or not? Xenia has already mentioned that Alte Schmiede hosts a number of different formats of literature events, like readings from newly released books and discussions on them, panel discussions. We also offer commented readings from historical texts. So we're talking about the 20th century, not about the Renaissance, but kind of historical texts. I also try to program dialogues between writers and academics to open the scope a little bit. We host a yearly festival for contemporary poetry, a yearly festival for auditive literature, a biannual festival for transmedial poetry. So this is just to give an idea of the scope of what Alte Schmiede does. We have 3 events per week from mid-September to late June. So that's quite a huge number. What is, I think, important to understand also the effects of the pandemic is that in my curation of the program, I also work closely with writers, meaning that writers in Altersschmiede are very welcome to realize and develop projects that are relevant for their writing. So they can approach me with ideas, but sometimes I would approach them and say, look, I know you're working on this and that. Would you like to do a smaller project in Altersschmiede? For instance, before Christmas, we had a project by Mieze Medusa. The Austrians might know her. She is a writer, but she also does a bit of hip hop and slam poetry. And she did a project called a project on the kind of intertwining of literature and hip hop and how one influences the other, how identity is negotiated in these different forms. Another example would be that the essayist and novelist Sabine Scholl, the Austrians might know her, did a project entitled Writing History. She invited writers from also from Austria, but also from Slovenia or the Czech Republic, writers who write on historical topics from Babylon to the Renaissance up to the NS period, National Socialism in Austria. And so it was readings followed by discussions on questions that are relevant for writers when they write about historical topics, like do they go to archives, do they work with oral history, what are their poetics and things like that. And what is important is that Sabine Scholl will now publish a book next autumn with essays based on these kind of discussions she conducted in Altersschmiede. So this is a part of Altersschmiede's work as well, that we're trying to support the work of writers also by enabling them to work on their kind of their literature or their essays by developing or by realizing projects in Altersschmiede. So what is a little bit connected also to what is in the title, the term in between literatures, is that Altersschmiede tries not only to invite super famous writers when they have new books, of course we do that as well, but we also try to invite writers who publish in small independent publishing houses. We try to enable writers to put projects into practice that are connected on a content level with their work. What is important to me as well is that we present books that are not necessarily canonized, and that can be part of what we do basically. What is our work like in times of COVID? I think we are, and this is connected with what I said at the start, we are very lucky insofar as that we are publicly funded, meaning that we can continue our work. Clemens Berger already hinted at that. We are live streaming our events, but of course we've moved solely to the digital sphere. We are not many venues can do that. I have to add that, for economical reasons, for infrastructural reasons. So I think we are quite the kind of bigger houses for literature. We are kind of lucky that we can do that, also because we don't lose any money because we have no audience. It's important for two reasons, I think. The first one is we can pay fees to writers, and this is essential because we can keep, and this is the second reason, we can keep the dialogue about literature going. Clemens Berger has asked a very relevant question, or observed the relevant question that I asked myself as well, namely, for a while with the omnipresence of the pandemic, we were asking ourselves, does literature have any room in the public sphere at all? So we are lucky that we can keep at least some of that debate going. Of course, in a digital and I think marginalized field in a way, because the digital shift, and this is something that Clemens Berger I think addressed as well when he was talking about audience numbers. The digital shift, I think, to some seems like an opportunity to generate new audience. I'm a little bit skeptical how well that works, for the very simple reason that people all over the world might be thrilled to finally attend New York's Met or Milan Scala, but the world is not waiting to finally attend Vienna's Altersschmiede, to be honest, as regretful as that is. At the same time, I feel that we're losing some of our core audience, also because our target group tends to be from a generation that might not be super digitalized, but I have no idea of the percentage, like how many, what percentage of that audience we're losing, because I'm not in touch with people. And this, I think, is the biggest problem for me. I'm not in touch. I usually know our audience. I'm usually present in the evenings. Of course, I don't know everyone in person, but I have a feel for who attends, who is interested in what. So I'm losing touch with the audience. That's the one thing. And the second thing is I was trying to explain how writers develop projects and ideas for us. And a lot of that happens in informal exchange after readings and events. And there is some kind of, I fear on the long run, maybe some kind of void, because it's more difficult to call me or send me an email than to just say after reading, look, Johanna, I'm currently working on this or that. Could you be interested in that? So this is how this shift to the digital sphere also affects our work, I think, due to the loss of the social aspect. And the social aspect, I think, is very important as a trigger for creativity and as a trigger for what we all do. I'm sure that Vasyl Lozynskyi and Clemens Berger have opinions on that as well and have experience with that as well. So that's just from my perspective. Maybe two other things I'd like to say is that I was trying to find ways of maybe reflecting on the current situation. We had an event in November, for instance, with two writers, Marlene Strerowitz and Daniel Wisser, who the Austrians of you will surely know. And it was like a debate called Literature during the Pandemic. And we were also trying to raise the question, how does it affect, and maybe Clemens Berger would like to say something about that as well later. I'd be very interested in hearing about his experience. How does it affect, for instance, writing about corporal presence, about characters who meet each other in a room? Or Daniel Wisser explained how it's different for him now that he cannot go to a certain place in which a paragraph in his literature is set and look at it, but instead of that, he has to do way more sketches on paper, and it takes more effort to create maybe space in his work. So I thought that was quite interesting, and I'd like to continue that. And maybe one final question I'd just like to put into the debate, because it concerns me about this digital shift, is that I wonder, or to put it differently, people, when I mention that we live stream our events, people usually, the second question or the first question they ask is how many people attend those events. And that is new to me, because that's not the second question people ask about Alte Schmiede normally. And why it concerns me is because in my program in practice, I sometimes put things in the program where I know not more than 50 people are going to be interested in that. But I put it on the program because I think it's important. It could be a young Swiss debut writer that no one has heard of in Austria, but I think he's good, so I'd like him to be part of the program. Or it could be on some kind of a female writer from the 1950s who is deceased and who is not canonized, but I think it's important to do something on that. And when people start constantly asking about numbers, I wonder how will it on the long run, how will it affect our program in practice? What will it do to independent publishing houses? What will it do to canonized or non-canonized writers? And maybe this will all disappear after the pandemic. It probably depends on how long we have to continue working in this digital field. But this is something that I don't have an answer to at all. But I just like to give this an example of the questions that are connected to the title of this panel on the long run. And this is maybe a brief insight into my work under COVID. And I'd like to return the ball or the shell to Xenia Kopf.
Thank you so much, Johanna. This was a lot of input, and I think we could discuss some of these points exclusively, and would be sticking around for a while because we would not be able to answer all these questions. But the last point you stressed about how digitization sort of entails or just has as an automatic consequence also the pressure towards efficiency and evaluation and rationalization of a field that maybe has not been so much affected by these developments that people in workplaces have felt for probably decades now. So I'd like to invite Vasyl to take the floor now, and we're circling back now to the practice of writing, the practice of translating, and Vasyl, I think, is going to read to us also some of his works. Vasyl, please go ahead.
Thank you, Xenia. Thank you for having me. To all the organizers, I'm very glad to participate at this panel. And I'll just start like with some few information about myself, like in addition to what was already told. So I'm currently working on several projects which are mostly translations from German literature, and I'm translating also Kafka, who is like can be considered more the Austrian writer, but who was living in Prague. And I'm just like also from Polish, English languages, but this is mine like almost a praxis from which I can learn also, and which is like more stable than like writing, because the inspirations are not predictable. So I can wait for some poem like for months sometimes, and while I'm traveling, I'm writing more. So this is my specific, and yeah, this situation was actually with the pandemic was actually for me a little bit like very common in some sense, but I had more worth to travel actually, and I was luckily could get like to Canada, and I would think this experience would be very unique, like to get here and just like to meet also the people in Canada, and because somehow I was connected through my partner to the Ukrainian Institute in Edmonton. But anyway, I'm like anytime working remotely, so it doesn't affect so much like where I'm in the present time, like staying. So and this like remote work has changed in a longer while ago because of the internet, because of emails, because of Facebook for sure, and also because of all the other like apps for meetings. Zoom just like was something what nobody have heard before, like epidemic. So it was like almost the marketing of Zoom like became this pandemic. So I would say it's always for me like a little bit like a point to complain on all this like social medias, because I feel there is something not ideal working and so on. For example, at Facebook is never possibility like to point like two places of living. For example, you have always like one place of residency, and because it's connected like to the I would say to the local community, which is like some advertisement, and you cannot like really advertise like some place from other region or something like this. But in this like global village mood, like how it's Marshall McLuhan was describing, so we stay all remote, and like our like phones or like devices are just like the extensions of our bodies, how he would describe it too. Yeah, we are all, yeah, like you told, Xenia, like connected and disconnected like at the same time, or like connected virtually but disconnected in the physical space, what's like different to like what changed our like perception of the like physical space. Yeah, I had a lot of thoughts about this moving through, or like from one literature to another one, transporting actually like some values, some like informations, and yeah, this is what makes yeah, the occupation of the translator so interesting, that you bring one poem from one context and you represent in the different one, and yeah, you translate the whole book and you almost like rediscover, giving a new life like to the book in other literature. So, but I would not be so much like concerned about the readers or like viewers at all the times. Like, for example, to take an example of Kafka, who was refusing to publish his novels, and he was writing like after his work during night times, and it was only for himself, like what he was like doing it only for himself. He would not give it to anybody to read even. And yeah, this is some kind of praxis of like self-reflection, and that's why his work are so meta-poetic, and you can read so much in them, like you can interpret them so deeply. And but at the same time, he was thinking, oh, I'm right now here in Prague, and I'm the epicenter of this city, like the spiritual epicenter. So it was just his imagination that made him so like maybe vulnerable, and at the same time so intellectually complicated. Yeah, I would like probably to speak later a little bit like about the bilingualism in Canada and Ukraine, and about some great names I have encountered here in Canada, and yeah, how the actually genre of the poetry is functioning right now during the I mean, it's just like in any time for poet, I think, yeah, we like the writer needs like some remote place to work. So the pandemic is yeah, almost ideal for writing, but like the reception of by the writers, by the I mean the reception by the readers and by the professional field changed, because everybody has like challenges and like some crisis and so on. So it's difficult like to think about yeah, this like field of production actually, and or I mean just to have some like result of yeah, like some feedback, I would say, just like general some feedback. Should I read some of my poems? Maybe just like which I think, yeah, could be. And I wanted to tell like this is for me like a little bit the situation of the going down like to some like crisis that already existed like in all the countries all over the world. So I would tell it's like some reverse migration. It's also like some kind of displacement, isolation. Like Ukraine would be kind of isolated, for me, isolated country from European Union like a few years ago, or from some other like context in the literature too, or it would be not very known. So it's something like unknown, and what in this field of like publishing in internet and like being present in internet can be like an opportunity, but I also agree with Johanna that it's like some kind of fake opportunity. So we should not like really. So I mean, in the outcome. So the outcome of like internet publishing is not really the same like it would be like a publishing a hard copy and so on. Okay, let me read one poem from the chapbook, which was actually also it's like interesting story. It was published in Hawaii by the local press there, like of the university, and they have like a Hawaii review there. And my translator Ostap King sent them like some few poems, and they have published just like very small chapbook. So I never went there, and so it's like also like some kind of disconnection. And I would think, okay, it's what is happening through internet, and I just got some few copies like for myself, and they were distributing it a little bit too. This poem is like about the time of when the war in Ukraine and Eastern Ukraine started, and it's a little bit like about the emigration and like the difficult circumstances in our land, in the eastern parts of it. So Fazenda Bar. This is a story about a job when people take vacation because of a war. They would like to work at a bar or at a reception desk, and they come for an interview. They can't get vacations in if their employer or position is important. Who gets vacation for 3 months anyway? Asks a girl who can't return to Donetsk, drinking her next cocktail at the bar. The manager's acquaintance worked as a dancer in Thailand. The girl wants to be invited to dance and asks the waitress if anyone's dancing in the other room where a DJ is playing, but it doesn't matter. We all sing and somebody says it aloud, and everyone continues reading the so-called news on their so-called phones. I can't believe this will one day be considered tourism, and the travel agency's slogan will read, "Run away."
Thank you so much for this poem, Vasyl. It was also one of my favorites in your collection that I read. That was published at Hochschule.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, also published in Germany. Yeah,
exactly. Yes. So this might be a good point to stick with a little. The question of literatures in the plural and languages, and the question of what makes a minor literature, what makes a major one. And because you pointed this out when we started thinking about this panel, Vasyl, that literatures and languages are not to be confounded. It's not the exact same thing. So I like to hear your thoughts on this maybe. And then I have one, I don't know if maybe it's a naive question, but when reading your poems in the collection, which is, by the way, for our listeners and participants, it's a bilingual collection. So Das Fest nach dem Untergang is both in Ukrainian and in German. And you usually have 2 pages facing each other. And on one side, there's the Ukrainian version, on the opposite page, the German one, I think. And I was wondering when reading this collection, what it feels like for a writer who's also a translator in your case, if the movement of the text of the poem into another language feels more like you are sort of appropriating another language with your thoughts, or if it feels like this text is more taken away from you, moving away from you, if it becomes some kind of different character. And I mean, this is more a question on poetics and less on COVID, but maybe we can stick with it for a moment, because you have quite a long experience, I'd say, in translating between Ukrainian, Russian, Polish, German, and English. I don't know if I missed a language here.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. I mean, Russian is the language I read in and I speak sometimes. And then this is like returning to the point of the bilingualism is the second language in Ukraine, but it's not officially the second language. And I would say, it's very different than in Canada, where you encounter, even like in the Western provinces, you encounter all inscriptions in French, and but also Ukrainian and Russian are very similar languages. So probably only the poets and some poetry should be translated, which is like more like a piece of art that have some other melodic rhythm or some pattern. Yes, this is like it's always different with translations, and it depends if, even like if I'm translating into Polish, that I speak quite well, but I still don't know so very well the other language, the language of the I would say of the final destination of the text, because only the native speaker can translate it the best, and I can only make some comments and say, okay, this is here like not very exact, but sometimes I can, like in the case of German translations, especially of my like some more hermetic texts, more complicated texts, I would say, okay, this sounds in German better than I would translate it, or even if it's like slightly changed from the original, because it's a kind of like phrase which is like linguistic phrase which is used in this sentence. And it's like a little bit like the return to the etymology of the words and to the like origins of the metaphor. But you cannot then change so much the phrase, but you can you need to find the right phrase in the different language.
Is there a specific example for this to pinpoint, maybe? And then I'm passing the question on maybe to Clemens. I would be no, but
think about this.
This is a discussion among all of us. So please just hop in if you have any questions to the other panelists. And I'd be interested also in Clemens' experience with translations. What do you feel happens to your text when they're translated?
Well, I mean, maybe I think maybe the strangest experience I ever had was one of my books. It's a collection of short stories. It's called Und hieb ihm das rechte Ohr ab in German. Was translated into Chinese. So one day I got a book, and the book looked good, and everything. And there was a strap. It was the Karlskirche Viennese church on the cover, which does not have any part in the book, which never comes up, but maybe it was just a kind of marketing, or it's a European, Austrian writer, and there we need some nice architecture and whatever. But the strange thing was to hold, I mean, it's a different thing to have an English translation, for example, right? I mean, I do speak English and I can read it, and I can even discuss it with the translator and say, maybe that part or that word or that phrase could be maybe a little bit different. But I mean, in Chinese, you just see science and say, okay, I think that's really wonderfully translated. So that was, yeah, really a unique experience, because they did also leave out one story, and maybe for some, I don't know, political reasons or what have you, I didn't really know it, but I could never, of course, read the book or have any thoughts on the quality of the translation. But I think, I mean, it was a good translator, and I talked to him a lot. Of course, I can't read it. And then the funny thing is that, and I did, so the other thing was, I didn't even know, and they never talked about it. I didn't even know how many copies they printed, if it was sold, how it did sell, or whatever. Until one day, now we're in social media again, I got a message, I think on Facebook, from someone I'm friends with on Facebook, and someone I don't really know at all, who is teaching in China, I think political theory or something like that. And he said, and he sent me a picture from a bookstore and said, I just saw a book, and it's your book. And so that was really a strange thing. And then I asked him to kind of do some research on the Chinese, because I wanted to know anything. I did not get any feedback or nothing. If there were any reviews, I don't know. So he went to all those Chinese Amazon kind of sites, and he said, there's lots of, I mean, it's a huge country. Okay, so what does it mean if there are hundreds of comments? And he translates some of the comments and said, so it's in which direction it's going. So I think that's the more extreme, or the utmost extreme example of talking about a translation when you're not at all able to read or look at the translation. But in general, and I think that was the question, I don't feel like it's taken away from me, but of course it's a really different thing writing novels the way I do than writing poetry like Vasyl does. So I just appreciate being translated, and I just appreciate that my stories enter other cultural spheres and languages.
Yes, of course. It's a question of distribution, dissemination also. And I know that Johanna has also dealt with translations and publishings in her former function as one of the heads of Hochrot Wien, which was a small DIY publishing house. I don't know if it's now operational or not, but maybe you can give us a little bit of an insight into your work then.
Well, interestingly enough, Hochrot is kind of the publishing network in which Vasyl's book was published, just to mention that again, in case not everyone remembered the name. And Hochrot is basically a network, a collective of smaller publishing houses in Germany, Austria, then Paris, Riga, and so different places. And it's not like there is one head company and everyone else does what this head company does, but it's more like really a collective. So it's also a kind of a political standpoint that we use to work as a collective. I'm not currently part of Hochrot anymore for time reasons, and Hochrot Wien is currently in a sleeping beauty, asleep basically, but might re-emerge again. But I think what we try to do in Hochrot as well is we try to because I know also from my work at Alte Schmiede that for writers who write in small literatures, I'm not talking about minor or minority literatures, but just small languages, it's very important for them to be translated also for economical reasons. When you look at Slovenia with a community of speakers of 2 million, you can do a rough count of how many of those would probably potentially buy books, and how many books can a Slovenian writer, especially a poet, potentially sell. We're not talking about millions. That's quite obvious. So for them, it's very important to be translated in like bigger languages. So when I was still working in Hochland, which I did for a couple of years in Hochland, Vienna, I published a book with a Slovenian writer, Anja Golob. That was her first translation into German, and that also facilitated for her for a next book to be published in a bigger publishing house. And also it was important, she asked me, would you publish my second book? And I said, I don't think we should. I think you should go to a bigger publishing house with more advertising budget, because we're happy to facilitate that people read your poetry in German, but then you need to move on. Or I also published a book by an Iranian poet. She gave a reading in Vienna and she had never been published. That is just, I think, one way. And maybe I could also mention that Alte Schmiede sometimes tries to facilitate translations as well. For instance, I actually heard or saw both a reading of this Iranian writer in a festival organized by Alte Schmiede. And there were just a handful of poems translated for this festival. And then I approached her and said, would you like to do a book? So sometimes Alte Schmiede tries to invite writers from who haven't yet been translated into German. We translate a couple of poems, and then we sometimes hope that this can facilitate a translation in form of a book. So like a proper kind of a book, and not just a translation of a handful of poets. And maybe can I just also ask Vasyl a question, because what comes to my mind when I'm saying that is that also for Alte Schmiede, I think literary magazines are quite important insofar as we try to present literary magazines. They have, especially for poetry, an important role, because you can discover poems by writers that have been translated from different language or that are not as famous yet, and they haven't published a book yet. And so I think literary magazines are an important forum for, especially for poetry, to discover new kind of works. And maybe I could ask Vasyl, because you are the co-editor of a magazine as well, maybe I could ask you about your experience. Is it similar in Ukraine? Do you read, do you also try to maybe read magazines, literary magazines in other languages, because you speak Polish as well, as you said? Is that also for you as a translator maybe a place where you find things you would like to translate? Would you be interested in saying something about that?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, I was recently thinking about this a lot, especially like some current publications, or like the publication of a current work in the magazines, like of my own work, but also like before the book is published, or before even I find the publisher, I would like to circulate the text I'm translating, like some like sample reading sample. So I'm publishing, like an editor, also not only my translations, but the translation of other people, also original works in online magazine, which is called Prostore, and also I'm editing the chapter which is called like Airlift, which refers to the Cold War situation, and with the closed West Berlin, and when the airlift was almost like, it was a aircraft lift which was built to bring some supplies to the Western Berlin. So I had worked with Austrian magazines too, with Lichtungen, and actually I was when I was studying like for a short time in Vienna, I went to the Lichtungen presentation in Alte Schmiede, actually. So that's where I was there at that time. Polish literature has, for example, much more magazines than Ukrainian, and all the Ukrainian magazines, there are only few of them. So I would say it's not a dynamic process in Ukraine at all. And also our magazine is sometimes having like some bigger periods of silence, but it's still very different than in the Western countries where the hard copies are well distributed, and also where there is more funding for the printing magazine. In Ukraine, you have like a lot of circulation of information, even on Facebook and so on, which is like kind of waste of time, I would say, almost, and waste of yeah. As to me, it seems the authors are not really much appreciated when they are just publishing online, and at the same time you have a big following like to the real like idols of Ukrainian literature, which are just like Shevchenko, who had like, we had some like yeah, just his birthday, around his birthday there is like some a lot of posting about like him. So it would be like if any German like intellectual would post something like about Goethe on the Goethe day. So nobody is doing this, but everybody reads Goethe, and there is some like critical discussion, but there is like not so much critical discussion about the literature in Ukraine. So you have this idealization. Yeah, I am very interested into the publication in the magazine. So, for example, in Canada, I would like to submit some poems to Brick magazine, or Manuscripte in Graz. They are going to publish some poems of mine. To discover, like through these new names, yes, it's like a good, actually, yeah, habit, like to read magazines, because you have all this diversity there, like some really interesting new styles, interesting new, I would say, yeah, use of from all different regions. Or for example, there was like some, I'm also thinking about some projects of anthologies, and it's actually very good source to know more about the region. If you read some anthology of Slovenian literature, of Ukrainian literature, yeah, this is very important, because not all literature is like available in the bookshops or even translated. So you just get like some yeah, short input, like, or insight to some other context and other system of the science, I would say.
Right. If I may jump in here, we have a little bit of a feedback, I think, from somebody. So just a reminder to all the participants out there, please use the Q&A functions. If you have any questions, just type them in and then we'll address them. And we have one question that was sent in, and I'm going to read it to you. It reads, are there any online communities or spaces where this translation work is happening or can happen, where poetic exchanges are being fostered? I think about organizations like wordswithoutborders.org and how they at least champion that process. I am not familiar with that platform, but maybe someone in this round knows a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I have encountered this website, and yeah, there are different possibilities, but it's always one language can prevalate, so the other one. And as to me, in North America, you have a very huge variety of diversity of all the actually scenes, and also in the speaking in the numbers, like the writing population, so to say, like all the master classes, in the workshops, in the creating writing at the universities, like poet teaching, like literature and so on. It's really totally different universe than in Europe, I would say. And you have a lot of emigre writers who are writing in English, and also a lot of translations which are not so much popularized in North America. So in general, I would say it depends very much from which context are you representing, in which language you aim to be translated, or what audience you aim to address. And I don't really like believe in the some kind of like it would be like called like some monopolization of the discourse. So I'm always speaking about the alternative writers. It's important, like how the publishing houses actually represent the literature, and are there only like few names? Is it always like what is something like in the Eastern European countries where there are also a lot of writers writing, but they are writing from some different motivations, I would say, or not only motivations, but like there's a different tradition of writing of poetry and of the reception at the same time.
So it's a difference in terms of genre of writing also. Did I get you right there?
A little bit. It's maybe connected to the folklore tradition a little bit. And at the same time, there is a lack of institutions and a lack of like platforms where you can publish it. So there are more like readings, almost like some open mics, or like not only open mics, but more like a performances, readings happening.
So maybe just a follow-up question for the other two panelists on this one. Online communities or spaces where translations happen or where poetic exchanges happen. Did you come across anything like that, Johanna or Clemens?
Well, no, I did not. I did not.
I think for poetry, I mean, I'm not sure if that was necessary translation. There is like an online platform called Fix Poetry, which was very important for quite a long time. It was hosted by a person in Germany, and it was important for a form of interchange, mainly, not only, but mainly also about poetry, where writers would also write reviews. So it was important, not necessarily, I don't think, for translation, but as a network that could maybe facilitate translation. But as far as I know, that's in my latest information dates back to last December, so 4 months ago. They didn't get enough funding, so they had to stop existing, which is a pity because it was an important platform. There is one kind of collective translation collective or group of translators in Vienna, but I don't actually think they're online, but I'm not sure. So one would have to maybe Google that. They're called Versatorium. starting with a V at the start, in case the person who asked the question doesn't speak German, Versatorium, and they are like a collective of translators, and they translate from quite a number of different languages. They translated from Georgian for a while, even though I don't think anyone really spoke German. So it's like also a very non-conventional approach to translation. They recently translated from Italian, Roberta da Punt. It's possible that I'm not sure what happens online, but I know that they really work as like a collective, and it's not necessarily individual translators. So I think what I like about the project is that it also enables a discourse about ways of translation, modes of translation, different cultural aspects of translation. But I've never been part of the collective, so I'm not sure about any details. But that could be interesting for the person who asked the questions. For
maybe we can type the name of this collective into the chat by sending it to all participants and listeners. And if you can use the chat function, just type it in. And then we have another question. Thank you, Johanna. One thing that by Ghana Humor, one thing that always surprises me in Vienna is the age of the audience attending the readings. In Austria, the audience consists mainly of older people. In Ukraine, I feel like it's mostly youth. Would Vasyl agree with that? And if yes, why is it so? What could Johanna tell out of her experience? Thank you. So I'm passing on this question to all three of you, actually. Have you noticed specifically specific age populations maybe attending readings, attending book launches or other different literary events?
Vasyl, would you like to start, or?
Yeah, that's true. It's like almost a myth about the Ukrainian audience. Yeah, as to me, it's like very easy to explain. It has its roots like in the Soviet system of the like actually prohibition of the gatherings. So and yeah, in Ukraine, the literature reading can be equal to the rock concert of the alternative use. So that's why like also a lot of Ukrainian writers try to perform with some bands, which is not always the good idea, because yeah, it's has to be more nuanced, like the combination of music and poetry. So they are like good poets, but not always good musicians or like singers. And yeah, I thought about this earlier, so it's just like my very brief explanation. And in Germany, yeah, it's like also about the socialization of the emirates, because it's like also a pity for a Ukrainian audience if they, I don't know, like if the emirates stay just home and they're not attending any social life, like it's just
maybe
it's
I can
mixed, it should be mixed. Yeah.
So you have a little bit of a parallel experience to our listener there,
Right, yeah.
from what I hear, in terms of the combination of musical performance and literature performance. I just recently heard a piece by the Dark Daughters. I think they are a Ukrainian band.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, and they used, I think, Shakespeare's sonnet for their piece and transformed it into an interesting piece of music. Definitely.
Yeah, yeah, it's
hope. And then I feel the urge to defend Austrian literary publics a little bit, maybe looking beyond Alte Schmiede there. I do remember going to readings in different venues, such as, for example, pretty popular places like Museumsquartier, and they had their series, I think it was called O-Töne, which was happening open air in the summer. And those events were always packed to the like last spot. So, and not only packed with older people, but really all age groups. I personally did not have the experience that it's it's usually older audience. But I'm curious what Johanna thinks about this.
It's funny just because you mentioned that, because I was quite recently, it was before the pandemic, so it's not as recently as I think it was, but I was talking to an established, quite famous Austrian writer, and he said to me, well, you know, the thing is, my audience when I started writing was quite young, but they grow, they get older, they age with me, and now the audience is my age, and that's the problem about this. And it sounds, I think he has a point in a way, because of course there is younger writers, maybe younger people, they discover younger writers. Of course you can't generalize that, but of course in a way the audience ages as well. When you go to a concert by the Rolling Stones, I'm not sure if you have 15-year-old teenagers there. I don't know, but so there is probably, there is this kind of weird amalgamation maybe when it comes to age of those, the audience and the artist. And as for alte Schmiede, I'm not sure. I think it very much depends on who's on stage, basically, to stick to that metaphor. So it very often depends on so the audience changes quite a lot. When there's younger writers, so maybe sometimes depends on the aesthetics as well. Sometimes when we cooperate with the kind of writing schools, I'm not sure what you call them in English. It's like creative writing universities. I don't think they would like it if I call them like that. So it's a translation problem. But then of course the audience will be younger as well. So and in Austria it depends a lot. That's that's what I observe as well. If the city has a university in a philology department or not, because I did the program in Linz for a year as when someone was on sabbatical, and Linz only has, you know, technical stuff in physics and law and stuff, and since they do not have a philology, that does reflect on the audience, I think. So that is a factor. I'm not sure how important that is in Ukraine, but that is a factor I think in Austria that I have observed might influence the audience.
Well, I mean, I think I agree with my fellow Viennese, and when the question came up, I thought it was a bit of a cliche that the audience in Austria and Vienna is all at readings. And but then again, I really think it's got to do with who is reading, right? So that's what I think both of you said, but maybe not even that. And it depends maybe on different venues, but I think there's a lot of younger and middle-aged people that are attending readings, at least out of my experience.
Thank you for your feedback, your thoughts. I see that Joseph has tuned back in, and I think he'll point us to the fact that it's already 7:20 here in Central European time, and we'll probably have to wrap up this panel, even though there's a lot more to discuss. And maybe I'd ask, or Joseph, did you want to ask a question? Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, just to shut things down, right? I'd actually had some comments based on what people were saying, and I have been listening. I might have turned off my camera, but I have been listening to all this. For example, I did go to a Rolling Stones concert years ago, and I got the impression that the audience was pretty old, but there were a lot of younger people there too. But I think the younger people were the children of the parent of the fans, right, or the grandchildren, for all I know, right? I went to see the Stones in the Orange Bowl in Miami, and it was packed, but the average age was really weird, since you had all these older people and all these really younger people, right? Because then the next generation would bring their children with them or something to give them the experience of a Stones concert. So that's neither here nor there, really. But I was thinking, when you were talking, Johanna, in particular, that a lot of my job as the director of the Worth Institute seems to be similar to yours, right? What we do is all this kind of cultural programming, and maybe Hannes, you can jump in about this too, about how do we work in the world of international cultural programming in this environment? Hannes already mentioned a little bit at the beginning of the presentations, but I just play off a couple things that were raised. One of them is that we reach now an international audience we never had before. And this kind of relates to Clemens' point about the Chinese, translation of his book. We had a lecture last week, we had 150 people at it. There's the numbers. Now we know how many people are at these things, right? And we know which country they're from. So I could say we had 140 some people or 150 from 4 different continents. And now people know about what's going on at the Worth Institute in Brazil, for example, which is something we never really had before. Or, how is the Worth Institute's activity, how are they being received in Australia? We had people in Australia, or Costa Rica, for heaven's sakes, right? So we have this reach that we didn't have before. Though I tend to agree with you, Johanna, I think about a little bit of skepticism about it, because one of the things we want to do is bring people together. And this doesn't work very well in this kind of a setting, right? What I liked, and maybe you remember, Xenia, our Central European cafes on Friday afternoons once a month. We have some, Torte or whatever, and coffee, and we sit around and we have different themes of discussions. But then afterwards, people just chat for a while, right? They chat with food in their mouths. Okay, fine, they need to learn some manners, but at least what they do is they interact, they communicate. And what we do is we bring like immigrant people from, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary, together with, Canadians and international students from Ukraine, and they chat together, and you can't do that in this setting, right? There's no way. I mean, I've got my tea, you've got your tea, you've got whatever you're drinking, and this is going to shut down, and we're all going to go off in our different directions. But, the cafes have that, and I think, Johanna, you talked about that too, the social world of this. The last point I would make is kind of related to Vasyl, is talking about the advantages to some people of this environment. One of the major things we do at the Institute, and this is Xenia is an example of this, is we give people spaces to write, time and space to write. We are kind of an incubator of writers. Right, what we want to do is we want to bring young doctoral students, it doesn't matter how old they are, excuse me, I said that, junior doctoral students, early career doctoral students into a situation where they have only the responsibility basically to write, and maybe do a little bit of stuff on the Central European cafes. Okay, pour some coffee or something too, but basically a year away from any other responsibilities. And some people have really benefited from this year that we're just sitting around at home by themselves. And so they're writing like crazy, and they're getting their dissertations done, and they're publishing articles, and they're doing all this other stuff. Other people, unfortunately, maybe it's related to field, personality, or whatever, are kind of flailing around, right? There's no structure. There's no ability to, have to come to the office at a certain time and be there and write at this many pages at that time or whatever. And so they're, I think, not benefiting from the lockdown as well as some people. I mean, some authors, some writers benefit from quiet and isolation, and some need that hubbub, that interaction, or the structure or whatever. So just a few random comments based upon what some of you were saying from the perspective of somebody who has for 10 years basically been producing all kinds of different cultural activities. And maybe that leads me to one other final point, excuse me for this, but after the shutdown in March, we just tried everything. I mean, we just went to try a little bit of everything, like digital online stuff, podcasts, panel discussions like this one, musical discussions, live discussions, films, everything. And that, I think, kind of pried open our possibilities, right? We have more possibilities post-pandemic than we probably had before, just because we were almost required or forced into this world of doing things which we hadn't done before. So I would say it's a mixed bag from my perspective. Some people have benefited. We've gotten the word out to Worth Institute, what the Worth Institute does in Brazil, to people in Brazil. Other people maybe not, and just that kind of cohesion of working together, bringing people together over coffee and cake, obviously doesn't work as well.
Hannes, would you like to add to that from your perspective as also a hub where events happen?
Yeah, definitely. I would very much agree with what Joe has just said. as the Word Institute, we see our role as a facilitator to bring, as I said in my introductory remarks, to bring creative people from both continents together. And but we want to enable them to come here to present their work here. And due to the pandemic, of course, this is not possible now. So we, like the Word Institute, moved to digital formats like this one. And this has certain advantages. I mean, like today, a panel with participants from Austria, from Edmonton, but especially when it comes to culture, also to scientific exchange, at the end of the day, in the long run, I think nothing can replace the in-person experience. Nothing can replace the in-person experience. It's about meeting people.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
I think that is a nice high note we could actually end on. But I think Clemens wanted to make a comment before.
Yeah, I just wanted, I mean, that's what I wanted to say. I mean, taking our situation right now, like each of us sitting in their, I don't know, living rooms or whatever, or on a porch maybe. But the thing is, I mean, that usually the real thing happens afterwards, right? I mean, after a reading, after a discussion, after, you know, we would, not only we, but also people from the audience would start talking to each other, and we would have a glass of wine, or maybe two, or maybe more, or maybe not. And maybe there would be a dinner, and you would start communicating and talking. And maybe even that would start some projects, or at least some interactions that kind of stay, and you stay in touch, and you stay connected, and there's something you are talking about and continue talking about, or one finds common ground, or one starts fighting. So all those things that really come with socializing and the after the event, which sometimes is the real event, or that the things you do remember about the place, about a venue, about reading, about a discussion. So I hope that this is going to be possible in one way or the other soon again.
Yes, yes. Definitely, the question is how to include anything informal in a format like this, and I think the larger conferences, I am sure that people are thinking about this a lot at the moment, because since last year nothing is possible, and I'm not sure if anything's going to happen in person this year either. So it's not only for smaller events such as these, but it's also for in academia, where we very often go to conferences all over the world, where of course both things are equally important. You get your formal inputs when you're listening to lectures and ask questions, but then at the same time, at least the same importance you can find in socializing with people from all over. Yeah, so I think we have one comment here from Sylvia Kroback from the Worth Institute. She says, I concur with what Clemens just said. Part of what we do is relationship building, and that is really hard to do online. So this is exactly what I was thinking about as well. But we also got a nice comment sent in by Eric Ney from OCAD University in Toronto, who's very interested in building a relationship with the Worth Institute. And he's really glad that he's come across us. So this was not really a question, but a comment and very positive feedback. And I think this actually shows that even this is possible. only, yeah, we have to make the efforts and we have to keep pivoting, I don't know, maybe for a little while. So thanks a lot to all the panelists, and I'll hand back to Joseph maybe to wrap the panel up.
Okay, well, thanks. Yeah, I should say to everybody too for participating, for agreeing to participate in this panel today, and then hopefully to stay in touch, right? The relationship building. This is not just, a one-off, I hope. Now, I know with Clemens, you've already been connected, but hopefully we'll continue this connection. And I would say to everybody on the panel and everybody still listening out there or watching or whatever, to remember that the Worth Institute and the Austrian Cultural Forum exist and that we do stuff and we're interested in new stuff as well. I hope I'm not speaking out of place to volunteer the Austrian Cultural Forum in this context, but generally speaking, we're open to ideas about how to connect up Austria to Canada in particular, but international connections in general. In addition, I should also thank again, Xenia, for all of the organizing that she's done. She really did the lion's share or lioness's share of the work in this for this operation today. She played a big role at the Institute in the year plus that she was here, and I hope that she also maintains contact. This is another thing we do at the Worth Institute. In addition to bringing people to Edmonton for a year, we hope to stay in touch with them forever. I mean, I don't know, once a Worth fellow, always a Worth fellow, right? So we have this network of our alumni who are scattered over parts of the globe, actually, Canada and a good part of Europe now, that we try to stay in touch with. And Xenia, again, thank you very much for your assistance. Whenever we do something at the Worth Institute, the people behind the scenes are Sylvia Krobach, who you saw briefly a moment ago, who put her, who acted in the Q&A, so something in the Q&A, and of course Rochelle Wright, who is behind the words below you here where it says Worth Institute. That's really kind of symbolic for the fact that Rochelle Wright is behind the scenes running things, right? She's the one who is the technology and communications specialist, so she helps with all, and she's been incredibly important this year, as you can imagine, given our switchover or our pivot, as people say, to this new environment. So thank you, Rochelle, for all of your continued help. The last thing I would say is that the Worth Institute has 2 more things going on this week that you're all invited to participate in. And Xenia is going to be back in action tomorrow. If you didn't have enough Xenia Kopf today, come back tomorrow at 11 o'clock because we have a panel that she organized called Innovations in Urban Studies, Lived Space and Everyday Life. This is part of the Transatlantic Conversation series sponsored by the Office of Science and Technology Austria in Washington, D.C., and connected to our partner institute at the University of California, Berkeley, and their Austrian Studies program. That's at 11 o'clock. And I see Rochelle has just put the link on here so you can go and see the connection to this event. We also have every Wednesday a new posting of a Central European talk of some kind. And so tomorrow we should have a recital and musical performance in association with a new CD produced by the Worth Institute. And you might want to come back to our website to see that. Okay, I think that's all the advertising, and we'll see everybody, I hope, again soon or at some point. Thanks for everybody, and thanks to everybody. Stay safe, and happy Easter if you celebrate the Latin Christian Easter, which is coming up. Happy Easter, and we'll see you tomorrow, right, at the next Worth Institute event. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye.